Imagine this. You're walking through a crowded room, laughter echoing from one side, a sea of small talk floating aimlessly through the air. Glasses clink. Smiles flash like reflexes. Everyone seems effortlessly connected, riding the invisible currents of social ritual. And yet, you feel none of it. No excitement, no comfort. Only the dull pressure of pretense tightening in your chest. You scan the room and wonder, not out of envy, but confusion, how is everyone so good at this? How do they summon such energy for conversations that evaporate the moment they end? How do they seem to need this? And why, when you try to join in, does it all feel like play acting? Like you're watching yourself from the outside, an actor miscast in a role you never auditioned for. You begin to sense a disconnect, not from others, but from the very desire to belong to this world. A longing for solitude you can't explain. An urge not to retreat in defeat but to preserve something sacred, your inner world. But here's the paradox, you're not lonely. In fact, you've never felt more yourself than when alone, deep in thought, reading, writing, creating, questioning. You don't crave validation. You crave clarity. You don't seek noise. You seek meaning. So you start to wonder, what if it's not that you're broken, but that the world is wired for something you were never designed to chase? What if your reluctance to play the social game isn't dysfunction, but insight? Society tells you otherwise, of course. You've heard it countless times, humans are social creatures. Isolation is dangerous. You need a tribe. There's an almost moral weight assigned to social participation, as if the frequency of your hangouts measures your psychological health. But what if this equation is flawed? What if the so-called need for constant interaction is not a human necessity, but a cultural addiction? Think about it. How often does being social really mean being authentic? How much of it is simply performance, masked by smiles, drowned in distractions, lubricated by alcohol, and driven by unspoken expectations? What if smart people see through it, and choose to step back, not because they can't connect, but because they refuse to pretend? There's a haunting beauty in this possibility, that perhaps intelligence comes with a certain solitude not by chance, but by design. What if the mind that questions more, feels more, sees more, also suffers more in the shallow waters of everyday socialization? You notice patterns others ignore. You question norms others accept. You crave conversations about life, death, suffering, consciousness, while others debate TV shows and Instagram stories. You don't fit in, not because you're antisocial, but because you're differently social. Not because you lack the skills, but because you reject the script. You want depth, not dopamine. And in this quiet rebellion, a truth begins to whisper beneath the surface. Maybe the desire to be alone isn't a weakness, it's a form of wisdom. But wisdom can be isolating. It turns crowds into noise, parties into prisons, friendships into negotiations of your soul. So here's the question that lingers, like smoke in the back of your mind. What if the smartest people, the ones who think deeply, feel intensely, and question everything, simply don't need the social life that others cling to? Not because they're arrogant. Not because they're damaged. But because they've seen something others haven't. Something unsettling. Something liberating. Something that explains why your silence feels more honest than most conversations. Why solitude feels less like absence, and more like presence. Why you'd rather spend a night with Dostoevsky than a crowd that never dares to think. What is that something? And more importantly, what does it cost to live by it? Because every truth you embrace separates you a little more from the world that rejects it. And the smarter you become, the more alone you may feel. But is that loneliness, or freedom? Let's go deeper. Most people confuse connection with proximity. But the truth is, you can be surrounded by people and still feel entirely alone. And in today's hyper-connected society, that loneliness runs deeper than ever. Why? Because modern social life isn't built on meaning. It's built on performance. We've created a culture of appearances, curated personas, filtered smiles, rehearsed small talk. You're expected to be charming, agreeable, interesting, but never too honest. Never too deep. Never too different. And those who can't, or won't, play the game? They're seen as misfits. Outliers. But often, they're the ones who see things most clearly. Carl Jung called this the persona, the social mask you wear to function in society. It protects you, but it also hides you. The danger? If you wear the mask too long, you forget who you are underneath. That's the cost of being social in a world that rewards conformity. The deeper problem is this. Modern society has pathologized solitude. We treat it like a disease. If you're not constantly texting, partying, posting, calling, you're isolated. Lonely. At risk. But solitude is not isolation. And it's definitely not weakness. It's a crucible, a place where transformation happens. This is something the great thinkers understood. Nietzsche walked alone for hours daily. Schopenhauer lived in solitude most of his life. Dostoevsky wrestled with the darkness of the soul in his writings, not surrounded by partygoers, but in silence, exile, and reflection. They weren't running from people. They were running towards truth. And truth rarely lives in a crowd. Gabor Mate, a physician who spent decades working with addicts, says that addiction isn't about substances, it's about pain. Pain that often stems from a lack of authenticity. A disconnection from one's true self. And what is modern social life if not a performance that forces you to hide who you are? We medicate the pain with distractions. Endless scrolling. Parties. Surface-level friendships. Dopamine loops. But smart people? They often can't play dumb with their pain. They feel it all too deeply. And so, they retreat, not to avoid life, but to face it head-on. This is why the world often misunderstands intelligent solitude. It sees quiet people and assumes depression. It sees introspective people and assumes weakness. It sees those who reject social norms and assumes they're lost. But perhaps they're just done pretending. Perhaps they're tired of shallow conversations. Tired of pretending to care about gossip, sports, or weekend plans. Tired of shrinking themselves to be more palatable. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people." Most people misunderstand this quote. Sartre wasn't saying all relationships are bad, he was pointing out the psychological prison of being constantly watched, judged, labeled. When you're always around others, you're always performing, always someone else's version of you. That performance becomes exhausting. And smart people? They're acutely aware of this. They notice the tension in their bodies. The false laughter. The subtle compromises. They feel the cost of being social, not just in time, but in authenticity. So they choose a different path. They choose to disconnect from the world, not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. Alignment with what? With their inner world. Their thoughts. Their depth. Their purpose. Because sometimes, being alone isn't loneliness, it's clarity. But here's the warning. Solitude is powerful, but it's also dangerous. It can heal you, but it can also isolate you to the point of no return. It can make you wiser, or colder. That's the paradox. The same solitude that sharpens your mind can also numb your heart, if you're not careful. So the key is not to reject people entirely, but to reject false connection. To replace quantity with quality. To speak less, but say more. To know when to be alone, and when to let someone in. That's the art of living as an intelligent outsider. To find balance between solitude and connection, on your own terms. Because the question isn't, do smart people need a social life? The question is, what kind of social life is actually worth having? Solitude will change you. Not overnight, not gently, but radically. Slowly, and then all at once. Because solitude doesn't just strip away distractions, it strips you down to the bone. It shows you what you've been running from. It introduces you to your real self. And that's where most people panic. Because beneath all the noise, beneath the roles, the identities, the social obligations, there's a frightening silence. a mirror without distortion. And for most people, that's unbearable. We've been raised to fear emptiness. To believe that if no one is around to reflect us, we cease to exist. But solitude reveals something terrifying and liberating. You are not who people say you are. You're not your name, your job, your social circle, your online persona. You're something deeper. Something wordless. Something eternal. But to access that truth, you have to sit in the silence long enough for your ego to scream. This is why most people avoid solitude. Because solitude is not comfort. It's confrontation. It brings you face to face with your contradictions. It surfaces your traumas, your regrets, your lies, your longing. It kills your illusions, one by one, until there's nowhere left to hide. And yet, this is precisely why solitude is sacred. Because in a world that rewards distraction, silence becomes revolution. And in a society that thrives on conformity, knowing yourself becomes an act of rebellion. But let's not romanticize solitude either. It's not always beautiful. It's often lonely, brutal, boring, agonizing. Sometimes you'll want to reach for your phone. Not to communicate, but to escape your own mind. Sometimes you'll crave even the most superficial company, just to avoid the existential void knocking at your door. But here's what separates the average from the awakened. The average person runs from that void. The awakened person enters it. Because they know something lives on the other side, something you can't find in a crowd, or a relationship, or a party. You can only find it in the abyss. Your truth. Carl Jung called it shadow work. The act of confronting the hidden, repressed, shameful parts of yourself that you were never allowed to acknowledge. And shadow work doesn't happen at brunch. It happens at 2 a.m., when you're alone with your memories. It happens when you realize your kindness is a mask for your fear. That your ambition hides your insecurity. That your social charm conceals a desperate need for control. This is the gift of solitude. It shows you who you really are. And the curse? It shows you who you really are. But something beautiful happens if you endure it. If you stay in the quiet long enough. You stop pretending. You no longer laugh at jokes that offend your soul. You no longer tolerate company that depletes you. You no longer chase attention because you've learned to give it to yourself. Solitude, once feared, becomes freedom. And this freedom gives rise to something rare, clarity. Clarity about what you value. Clarity about who you are. Clarity about where your energy should go, and where it should never go again. This is the paradox. The more time you spend alone, the more clearly you see the world. But the more clearly you see the world, the less of it you want to participate in. You begin to notice the fakery in everyday conversation. The manipulation in media. The emptiness in material ambition. And most painfully, the hollowness in relationships you once thought were real. So you shed them. Not in bitterness, but in peace. You no longer need to prove anything to anyone. You no longer crave validation. You no longer negotiate your value. You walk alone, not because you have to, but because you can. At some point, you accept it, you're not meant to fit in. Not because you're flawed. Not because you're broken. But because you see too much, and this world wasn't built for people like that. You see the hidden motives behind polite smiles. You hear the fear in loud voices. You notice the tension in conversations that others call fun. You sense the spiritual decay hiding beneath luxury and success. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You walk through the world like an observer, not a participant. Not because you don't care, because you care too much. This is the curse of the intelligent outsider. You understand people far more than they understand you. You speak a language that doesn't translate well in crowds. You crave silence in a world that fears it. You ask questions that others find uncomfortable. You seek meaning while others seek convenience. You value depth while the world worships speed. And in return? You're called distant. aloof, complicated, too intense, too serious. But what they don't realize is that your seriousness is love in disguise. You take life seriously because you know how fragile it is. You take people seriously because you see the pain behind their eyes. You take truth seriously because you've seen what lies can destroy. But there's a cost to being this way. You'll lose people. You'll sit alone at dinners. You'll be misunderstood by family. You'll scare off lovers who aren't ready for your honesty. You'll watch as others bond over things you can't pretend to care about. And you'll question yourself. Am I too much? Too cold? Too distant? No. You're just living in a world that rewards pretending, and you refuse to play along. Fyodor Dostoevsky once wrote, "To live without hope is to cease to live." But what he didn't say is that to see the world too clearly is to almost lose hope. You begin to notice how little people think. How easily they betray themselves for approval. How quickly they sell their souls for comfort. And it breaks your heart. Not because you're angry, but because you understand. You were once like them. You know how seductive the lie is. How tempting it is to trade authenticity for acceptance. But you've made a different choice now. You've chosen to stand alone. That doesn't mean you're bitter. It means you've stopped waiting for the world to catch up. You've stopped explaining yourself. You've stopped hoping that one day everyone will understand your silence, your depth, your detachment. Because here's the truth. You don't need to be understood to be at peace. You don't need a tribe. You don't need a crowd. You don't need to be constantly seen, heard, or validated. You need only one thing. To remain true to what you know. To your mind. To your values. To the quiet voice inside that tells you, this is not your path. And here's the twist. The more comfortable you become with solitude, the more magnetic you become. People start to notice your presence. They feel the calm in your energy. They sense that you don't need them, and ironically, they're drawn to that. Not everyone will understand you. But the right ones will recognize you. Not through noise, but through stillness. Not through charm, but through depth. They'll feel it in your silence. In your gaze. In your refusal to play small. And you'll realize. You were never meant to belong to the world. You were meant to remake it, quietly, patiently, from the edges. As an outsider. As a thinker. As one of the few who stayed awake. Final question. So, do smart people really not care about social life? No. It's not that they don't care. It's that they've outgrown the version of social life the world offers. They want something real. Something deep. Something rare. And if that means walking alone for a while, so be it.